In April 1956, the most famous actress in the world paid $2 million to marry a prince and walked into the most beautiful prison in Europe. 26 years later, she would die on the road above it. There is a photograph of Grace Kelly on her wedding day in Monaco. The veil is soft around her face, the lace lies pale against her throat, and beside her stands Prince Rainier, the ruler of a country small enough to be crossed in an afternoon, yet old enough to carry 7 centuries on its back. She looked to the world like a woman stepping into a dream, an Oscar-winning actress leaving Hollywood for a prince, a beautiful American crossing the sea to become Her Serene Highness, a crown, a palace, a new name. And yet, the bargain beneath the silk was much harder than the picture allowed. Grace did not merely marry a man. She entered a country that needed an heir, an image, and a miracle of publicity. She paid to enter it. She surrendered her work. She learned rather quickly that even a palace could be a golden cage, and that a scepter placed in the hand could still be another kind of chain. Everyone knows the actress who became a princess. Fewer remember the woman who spent 26 years trying to remain herself. This is the story of Grace Kelly, the girl who won Hollywood, lost it at 26, and found that the palace, for all its beauty, still had bars. And the door, once closed, did not open again. November 12, 1929, Philadelphia. The Kelly house stood in East Falls, in a city of stone steps, Catholic discipline, winter coats, and ambition polished until it shone. Grace Patricia Kelly was born into a family that believed in winning. Her father, John Brendan "Jack" Kelly, had been an Olympic rowing champion, a man who had made his fortune in brickwork, and who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built both his body and his business by force of will. Her mother, Margaret Major Kelly, had been a model and was connected to women's athletics at the University of Pennsylvania. The house did not worship softness. It admired strength, trophies, endurance, and visible achievement. Grace was the third of 4 children, and from the beginning she seemed slightly out of tune with the music of that family. Her siblings were athletic, competitive, sure-footed in the Kelly way. Grace was quieter. She was imaginative. She liked rooms of her own, dolls, invented stories, the small theatre of childhood where one could decide the ending before anyone else entered. There is a kind of child who survives a loud house by becoming still, not weak, not absent, merely still. Grace was that sort. She watched before she moved. She absorbed before she spoke. Later, men would call that reserve elegance. Hollywood would call it mystery. Alfred Hitchcock would look at her and see ice over fire. But before all that, it was simply a girl in Philadelphia learning that attention could be both desired and dangerous. At 12, she appeared in her first neighborhood theater role. It was a small beginning, but such beginnings matter. A stage offers a curious mercy to a shy child. There, one may be seen and hidden at the same time. One may speak through another person's lines. One may be applauded for pretending. By 18, Grace had told her family she wanted to become an actress and moved to New York to study drama. Her father did not think much of it. Acting, to him, was not the sort of profession that belonged to a respectable Kelly. He doubted her. He expected failure. His disapproval became one of the rooms Grace would spend much of her life trying to leave. She went anyway. In New York, she enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She lived in a residence for young women from proper families, the sort of place meant to reassure parents that rebellion had not gone too far. She graduated in 1949 and began the slow work of making herself useful in a difficult trade. She modeled. She appeared in advertisements. She worked in television commercials and live television. She took small roles. She auditioned and auditioned again. The old theatre, the television studio, the advertisement set, each taught her something: stillness, timing, how to let a camera come to her rather than chase it, how to appear composed while wanting very badly to be chosen. Her father's doubt followed her, but so did his discipline. Grace had inherited more from him than either of them may have wished. She was not loud in her ambition, but she was stubborn. She did not storm the gate. She waited beside it until someone opened, and then she walked through with her head high. She did not yet know that one day the world would place a borrowed crown upon her, nor did she know the price that would be asked when she accepted it. First, Hollywood had to find her. The film career began quietly, almost modestly, with 14 Hours in 1951. Then came High Noon in 1952, opposite Gary Cooper, and the door opened wider. Grace had not been working in films for very long, yet already there was a quality about her that held the eye. She did not fill a room by force. She drew silence towards herself. In 1953, she appeared in Mogambo with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner. It brought her a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. A young actress could wait years for such attention. Grace seemed to rise with a speed that unsettled even those who admired her. Then came 1954, the year in which her career seemed to gather itself into one bright blaze: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, The Bridges at Tokori, The Country Girl, Green Fire, 5 films in 1 year, and among them a role that stripped away the polished surface audiences expected. In The Country Girl, she was not merely lovely, she was tired, wounded, plain in ways the screen rarely allowed her to be. On March 30th, 1955, Grace Kelly won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Country Girl. She was 25. She had made only a handful of films. She had already become one of the defining faces of the decade. There are moments in a life when everything appears to be gathering upward. Grace had worked with Hitchcock, who understood the power of her restraint. He directed her in Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and then To Catch a Thief, filmed on the French Riviera with Cary Grant. The Riviera light loved her, so did the camera, so did the public. She became a paradox men thought they understood: cool, but not cold, elegant, but not remote, controlled, but carrying some private warmth just beyond reach. She was spoken of as the opposite of Marilyn Monroe, a different kind of glamour, one that did not seem to ask for attention and therefore received even more of it. And yet, the bright room had its corners. By the spring of 1955, Grace was already worn down by fame. Her studio contract restricted what she could choose. Photographers waited outside her apartment. Her private life had become a public pastime. A relationship with designer Oleg Cassini had collapsed, and the press had treated her heart as though it was studio property. She had taken up the scepter of Hollywood power, but it was lighter than it looked and sharper where the hand held it. That May, during the Cannes Film Festival, French journalists arranged a visit between Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III of Monaco. She was in France promoting To Catch a Thief. He was the sovereign of a principality that needed more than charm to survive. The meeting was not the thunderbolt the world later preferred. It began as a photograph, a courtesy, a carefully arranged encounter in a palace that knew the value of images. Afterward, letters passed between them. Rainier visited the Kelly family at Christmas. It was only their second meeting. He proposed soon after. Grace accepted. Her friends were stunned. She had scripts, directors, leading men, money, beauty, and the favor of the public. Yet she told people she believed her acting life was over. Perhaps she saw love. Perhaps she saw escape. Perhaps she saw a role so high that even her father could not dismiss it as foolish. She was 26. She had an Oscar. She had no idea what she had just agreed to. Monaco, in those years, was not simply the sparkling little kingdom of postcards. Beneath the casino lights and sea air lay anxiety. Its economy depended heavily on gambling and on the institutions tied to Monte Carlo. The old glamour had begun to thin. Newer resorts had appeared elsewhere. The post-war world was changing. Monaco needed money, attention, and legitimacy. It also needed an heir. Under the Franco-Monegasque Treaty of 1918, if the reigning prince died without a legitimate Grimaldi heir, Monaco's sovereignty could be threatened. That is not romance, that is statecraft. A prince without an heir was not merely a lonely man. He was a national problem. Aristotle Onassis, who held a major interest in the Société des Bains de Mer, understood spectacle and American money. Father Francis Tucker, Rainier's chaplain and advisor, had encouraged the prince to marry an American Catholic woman who could produce an heir. Grace Kelly fit the need with almost cruel perfection. She was Catholic, she was famous, she was beautiful, she was American, she was fertile, or so the palace intended to know. Before the wedding, Grace underwent a medical examination. Rainier's earlier relationship with French actress Gisèle Pascal had ended after a palace-arranged examination reportedly concluded that she could not have children. Whether that judgment was fair or true belonged to another sad room. The point was simpler and colder. Fertility mattered. Grace passed. Then came the dowry. The palace required $2 million. Grace paid half from her own earnings, and her father paid the other half, though he found it humiliating. It was said he objected bitterly to the idea that his daughter should pay a man to marry her. Whether the exact words were ever spoken hardly matters. The insult was plain enough. We have all known, fellow travelers, some version of this bargain. A woman praised for being chosen, while no one looks too closely at what she must surrender to be chosen. April 1956. Grace married Rainier in Monaco in 2 ceremonies, civil and religious. Around 30 million people watched on television. MGM helped turn the wedding into a global event. Her gown, designed by Helen Rose, was made of silk taffeta and antique Brussels lace. The world saw a bride. Monaco saw a solution. Then the door of the palace closed behind her. Her French was imperfect. Court life required fluency, confidence, instinct, and obedience to customs she had not grown up inside. The old Monegasque families looked at her as a foreigner, an American, an actress. The staff belonged to Rainier and to the Grimaldi line, not to her. She could not stroll to a cafe as she pleased. She could not make private calls with the freedom she had known. She could not simply go where she liked. At 26, she had given up a career at its height for a part whose lines had not been fully given to her. Princess Caroline was born in January 1957. Prince Albert followed in March 1958. Princess Stephanie arrived in February 1965. With Albert's birth, the succession problem was solved. Monaco had its heir. And once that duty had been fulfilled, there remained the question no one seemed prepared to answer. What was Grace for now? By 1962, Grace had been Princess of Monaco for 6 years. The first rush of the wedding had faded. The children had begun to fill the palace with noise and need. Monaco had its heir. Grace had learned enough French, enough ceremony, enough endurance. She had smiled where she was expected to smile, stood where she was placed, and become the public face of a small country that had needed her beauty more than it had known what to do with her soul. Then, Alfred Hitchcock offered her Marnie. He had directed her in 3 films and wanted her badly for the part. The role was darker, more complicated, more psychologically troubled than the polished women Hollywood had often asked her to play. For Grace, it was not simply another film. It was a door reopening, a chance to prove that the actress had not been buried beneath the princess. Grace and Rainier initially agreed. The palace announced the project in March 1962. Newspapers reported that Princess Grace would return to the screen. For a little while, one imagines the room changed. Scripts on a table, letters, schedules. A woman allowing herself to think of camera marks, lines, costume fittings, the old rhythm of work. A private warmth returning to the hands. Not freedom, perhaps, but something close enough to make the heart unwisely hopeful. Then Monaco objected. The people did not like the idea of their princess returning to Hollywood to play a thief. Letters arrived. Local criticism grew. Members of the clergy objected, and the timing could not have been worse. Monaco was locked in a political crisis with France. President Charles de Gaulle wanted Rainier to bring Monaco's tax policies closer to France's and stop serving as a haven for French wealth. Rainier refused. In October 1962, France would threaten customs barriers around Monaco, a pressure that could have economically surrounded the tiny principality. In that climate, Grace could not leave for Hollywood. She withdrew from Marnie in June 1962. The role went to Tippi Hedren. Grace never returned to acting, and that was the moment the scepter slipped. Not in the cathedral, not at the first curtsy, not even when the studio contracts ended. It slipped when the woman who had believed some portion of herself might yet be recovered found that the palace could say no, and the no would be final. Rainier's opposition was not only political. He had a temper and had been raised to expect authority. He was married to a woman more famous than he was. Crowds called her name. Cameras followed her. Journalists noticed his discomfort beside her. The imbalance lived between them. His control of her schedule, his limits on travel, his resistance to Marnie. All of it made the marriage harsher than the wedding photographs could bear to admit. And yet, it was not the simple nightmare sold by gossip. There was affection. There was partnership. There was frustration, duty, distance, and love made difficult by rank. That perhaps was nastier in its own way. Not villainy, not melodrama. A marriage where the cage did not always look like cruelty, and so no one came to unlock it. After Marnie, Grace understood something she could no longer dress in hopeful language. She would remain a princess, and only a princess, for the rest of her life. The years after 1962 did not reduce Grace to idleness. That would be too easy a story and too unkind. She did not sit in the palace merely fading beneath jewels. She worked. She expanded the Monegasque Red Cross. In 1963, she created Amade Mondiale, the World Association of Children's Friends, devoted to protecting children from physical and psychological abuse. She supported the Monte Carlo Ballet. She helped Monaco strengthen its cultural identity. She gave attention to theatre, film, dance, and young artists. Rainier called her his Minister of Culture, Leisure, Health, and Youth. There was dignity in that work. There was purpose. There was also an ache beneath it, for usefulness is not the same as freedom. Grace had lost one life and built another, but the first life did not vanish simply because protocol required silence. Hollywood remained in the room like music heard through a wall. She returned to America when she could. She saw old friends, including Cary Grant and Hitchcock. She found ways to perform that did not offend the palace. She appeared in documentaries. She recited poetry and Shakespeare. She used her voice where the camera was no longer permitted to claim her. The family retreated whenever possible to Rock Aigle, the country property in the hills above Monaco. There, away from photographers, Grace could be more herself. The children played outdoors, horses, meals, ordinary laughter, Sunday mornings. She filmed them with her own camera, preserving the private life that public life threatened to consume. In America, with her relatives, she could cook, joke, drink beer, roller skate, and become Gracie again, if only for a little while. But the watching never ceased. The paparazzi measured her body like a weather report. If she gained weight, they said she was pregnant. If she lost weight, they said she was ill. Grace had once believed that posing for photographs might satisfy the photographers and make them leave the family alone. They did not. The machine ate what it was given and waited for more. It is the part of these stories we want least to hear, that admiration can become another form of possession. The world says it loves a woman, and then takes her privacy as proof. Her marriage settled into something complicated. Rainier was strict, old European in his expectations, accustomed to command. Grace brought warmth and informality to the household. She sat on the floor with her children. She read to them in English. She tried to raise them with manners, kindness, and some memory of ordinary American family life inside the formal rooms of Monaco. As the children grew older, the household became harder to hold together. Caroline rebelled first. At 21, she married Philippe Junot, a much older French banker and playboy. Grace and Rainier disapproved, but the wedding happened in 1978. The marriage ended in 1980. Stephanie brought another kind of worry. As a teenager, she pushed against palace rules and wanted a life of modeling, music, independence, and choice. Grace, who understood something about wanting a life beyond the one assigned to you, spent her final years trying to guide her youngest daughter through those dangers without breaking her spirit. By 1980 and 1981, Grace was not calm, decorative, or empty. She was managing public duties, philanthropic work, children's crises, and the private labor of remaining intact. Around 1979, she began spending more time in an apartment on Avenue Foch in Paris. It was not a clean separation from Rainier. It was a workshop for the parts of her that the palace could not house. She performed poetry readings with British actor John Westbrook in Europe and the United States. She made pressed flower botanical art, and that work appeared in galleries in Paris, New York, and Tokyo. It sounds delicate pressed flowers, almost too gentle for the weight of her story. Yet there is something fierce in it too, the attempt to preserve beauty after it has been cut from its original stem. Still, the crown had grown hollow in places, not worthless, not loveless, but hollow enough for an echo. In April 1982, she gave an interview in which she rejected the idea that her life was a fairy tale. She described herself as a modern woman coping with ordinary human problems. It was a plain statement, and therefore a sad one. She had spent decades as an image, and there she was, asking to be recognized as human. That summer, she took what would become her last family cruise in Northern Europe. She was 52. She still carried her camera, still watching, still preserving, still trying to hold the world in frames before it slipped away. The autumn was waiting on the road above Monaco. September 13th, 1982. The road from Roc Aigle toward Monaco bent down through the hills, above the sea, along the Moyenne Corniche. The morning was clear. The cliffs held their old indifference. Below lay Monaco, small and bright, the palace, the harbour, the life Grace had entered 26 years before. She was driving a Rover 3500. Her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie, was in the passenger seat. They were travelling from the family's country home back toward Monaco when Grace suffered a stroke or cerebral hemorrhage at the wheel. The car went out of control. It struck a retaining wall, tipped, and fell down the mountainside. Stephanie survived with injuries, including bruising and a hairline fracture. Grace was found alive but unconscious. She had suffered catastrophic injuries, and there was a second, larger stroke associated with the crash. She was taken to Monaco Hospital. At first, the palace announced that Princess Grace had suffered broken ribs and a fractured leg. It did not tell the public the severity of her condition. It did not speak plainly of the stroke, the brain injury, or the fact that the situation was grave. The world was allowed to imagine recovery. Less than 24 hours later, it was told she was dead. That gap became a chamber where rumors bred. Some claimed the brakes had failed. Some claimed darker forces. Some claimed Stephanie had been driving. The rumor about Stephanie was especially cruel. She was 17, injured, and had survived the crash that killed her mother. The evidence placed Grace in the driver's seat and Stephanie in the passenger seat. But gossip is a beast that does not apologize when fed. Grace Kelly died on September 14, 1982, at age 52, after her family agreed to remove life support. Prince Rainier and her children were with her. There is a stillness after such a sentence. A hospital room, a family gathered, a life once lived under lights ending beneath white sheets and medical quiet. No camera could make it graceful. No title could soften it. Her funeral took place on September 18, 1982, in Monaco. She was buried in the cathedral where she had married Rainier. Stephanie, still injured, could not attend. Rainier sat in the front row and wept openly. Whatever had been difficult between them, whatever distance had entered the marriage, his grief was visible. He ruled for another 23 years and never remarried. Her rooms remained as she had left them. He visited her grave. When asked about her, he often answered briefly or turned away from the subject. In 2005, he died and was buried beside her. The scepter had fallen, not with spectacle, not with thunder, but on a mountain road, with a daughter beside her and the sea below. And afterward, the palace learned the old truth of all palaces. Marble does not keep the dead. Grace Kelly's life is often reduced to images: the cool blonde in Hitchcock's Rooms, the Oscar winner with a careful smile, the bride in lace, the princess waving from a balcony, the wrecked car on the road above Monaco. Images are tidy, lives are not. She was shy and determined, obedient and rebellious, public and private, dutiful and artistic. She wanted to please her father, then Hollywood, then a prince, then a country, and still somewhere beneath all that pleasing, there remained the girl who had once invented worlds alone in her room. We watch these lives, fellow travelers, and something stirs because the distance between splendor and loneliness is never as wide as we hope. All that beauty, all that ceremony, all that gold with its shadow beside it, and still a woman could miss her work, struggle in her marriage, worry over her children, and long to be known without costume. Her story was not the simple romance the public bought in 1956. Nor was it only the grim tale later gossip preferred. It was stranger and more human than either. She was used and she was loved. She was trapped and she built meaning. She lost the screen and then gave years to children, artists, hospitals, stages, dancers, and the small acts of culture that outlast applause. 1 month before her death, she was asked how she wished to be remembered. She wanted to be remembered as someone who tried to do her job well, as understanding and kind, as decent and caring. It was not a grand answer. It did not glitter. Perhaps that is why it remains. In the wedding photograph, the veil still glows. The smile still holds. The world still sees the princess stepping into the dream. But look longer. Behind the lace stands the woman who paid, surrendered, endured, and kept trying to make a life inside the part she had been given. And somewhere in the silent palace, the fallen scepter lies where the picture cannot reach it. If you found yourself in this story, even for a moment, you may find yourself in the next one too. Subscribe to The Fallen Scepter and stay with us. There are many more lives to remember.